The morning sun cast long shadows across the Rocky Mountain Trail as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the reins of their overloaded wagon. Her 3 children sat huddled together in the back, wrapped in worn blankets against the October chill. 8-year-old Emma clutched her rag doll, while 5-year-old Tommy pressed his face against the wooden side, watching the steep canyon walls rise around them. Baby Lucy slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle, unaware of the dangerous journey ahead. Sarah's husband had died in a mining accident 6 months earlier, leaving her with nothing but debts and 3 hungry mouths to feed. The only hope lay in reaching her sister's homestead in Colorado, 200 miles through treacherous mountain passes. With winter approaching fast, this might be her last chance before the snows made travel impossible. The wagon groaned under the weight of their few possessions and supplies for the 3-week journey. Sarah had sold everything of value to buy provisions, but even then, she could only afford the bare minimum. The old mare pulling the wagon was past her prime, bought cheap from a farmer who warned that the animal might not survive such a demanding trip. "Mama, I'm scared," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the creaking wheels and jingling harness. Sarah forced a smile she didn't feel. "We'll be fine, sweetheart. Just a few more days, and we'll be with Aunt Margaret." But Sarah's confidence was false. The trail guide she'd hired had abandoned them 2 days earlier, claiming the route was too dangerous for a woman traveling alone with children. He'd taken half her money and disappeared in the night, leaving only crude directions scratched in the dirt. Now they were following what appeared to be an old mining road that wound precariously along the edge of a deep ravine. The path was barely wide enough for the wagon, with loose rocks and washouts making every step treacherous. To their right, the mountain rose almost vertically. To their left, the ground dropped away into a chasm so deep that the bottom disappeared into shadow. The morning had started well enough, but as the hours passed, Sarah noticed storm clouds gathering over the peaks ahead. The temperature was dropping, and she could smell snow in the air. Worse, the old mare was showing signs of exhaustion, stumbling occasionally on the rocky path. Around midday, they encountered another traveler coming from the opposite direction. A tall, weathered man on horseback approached them, his keen eyes taking in their situation with professional assessment. He wore the practical clothing of a mountain guide, with a coiled rope across his saddle and the confident bearing of someone who knew these mountains intimately. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim, "name's Jake Thompson. I track missing folks for the territorial marshal. This trail you're on leads to a dead end about 5 miles ahead." Sarah's heart sank. "But the map shows it connects to the main road." Jake shook his head grimly. "That map's 20 years old. There was a rock slide last spring that blocked the pass. You'll have to turn back and take the long way around through Devil's Canyon." "How long would that add to our journey?" "Week. Maybe 10 days if the weather holds." Sarah calculated quickly in her head. They had food for perhaps 6 more days, and winter was closing in fast. The detour would mean traveling in snow, with exhausted animals and frightened children. But turning back seemed like their only option. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "I suppose we have no choice." Jake studied the family more closely, noting the children's thin faces and the woman's worn clothing. He'd seen plenty of desperate families trying to make it through these mountains before winter, and too many had never made it out. "Where you headed, if you don't mind me asking?" "My sister's homestead near Colorado Springs. We lost my husband in a mining accident, and there's nothing left for us back in Kansas." Jake nodded thoughtfully. He'd been tracking a gang of horse thieves for 3 weeks and was eager to get back to town, but something about this family's desperate situation touched him. Maybe it reminded him of his own wife and daughter, killed in an Indian raid 5 years earlier. "Ma'am, I know a shorter route that might work. It's dangerous, but it could save you a week of travel time. There's an old logging road that cuts through the high country. Most folks don't know about it, and it's steep as blazes, but it's still passable if you're careful. Sarah looked at her children, then back at the gathering storm clouds. How dangerous. The road runs along some mighty deep ravines, and there are places where one wrong move could send you over the edge. But with the right guidance, it's doable. I could lead you through if you're willing to trust a stranger. The wind was picking up now, carrying the first few snowflakes. Sarah knew they were running out of time and options. Winter would trap them in these mountains, and they'd never survive without proper shelter and supplies. Would you really do that for us? Jake looked at the children again, remembering his own daughter's laugh that he'd never hear again. Yes, ma'am. I reckon I would. Jake Thompson rode ahead of the wagon, his experienced eyes constantly scanning the narrow trail for signs of danger. The logging road he'd mentioned was even more treacherous than he'd described to Sarah, but he knew it was their only realistic chance of reaching safety before the storm hit in full force. The path wound along the spine of a ridge with steep drops on both sides. Ancient pine trees clung to the rocky slopes, their branches heavy with fresh snow that fell steadily now. The temperature had plummeted, and Jake could see his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind him, Sarah struggled to control the increasingly nervous mare. The old horse sensed the danger of the narrow trail and shied at every sudden sound. The wagon wheels were only inches from the edge in places, and loose rocks frequently tumbled into the abyss below. "Easy, girl, easy," Sarah murmured to the horse, her knuckles white as she gripped the reins. In the back of the wagon, Emma had wrapped her arms around Tommy, both children staring wide-eyed at the terrifying drop beside them. Baby Lucy had awakened and was beginning to fuss, perhaps sensing the tension in the air. Jake called back over his shoulder, "We're coming to the worst part now. There's a section where the road narrows to maybe 6 feet wide with a sharp curve around a rock outcrop. Take it real slow and stay as far right as possible." As they approached the curve, Jake dismounted and walked back to examine the wagon more closely. The load was shifting dangerously, with heavy sacks of flour and dried beans that had worked loose from their ties. The weight distribution was all wrong for such a precarious passage. "Ma'am, we need to redistribute this load before we go any further. The wagon's listing to the left, and that's exactly where we can't afford to have extra weight." They spent precious minutes rearranging supplies while the snow continued to fall. Jake worked quickly, his mountain experience showing as he repositioned the heaviest items toward the center and right side of the wagon bed. The children helped as much as they could, though their small hands were growing numb with cold. "Will you ride with us through this part?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. Jake shook his head. "Better if I lead the horse on foot. That way I can see exactly where we're going and stop if there's trouble." He took hold of the mare's bridle and began walking slowly forward. The path curved sharply to the right, around a massive granite boulder, the outside edge crumbling away into a ravine that seemed to have no bottom. Sarah could hear the distant sound of rushing water far below, though she couldn't see the stream through the swirling snow. Step by careful step, they inched around the curve. The wagon wheels crunched on loose gravel, and Sarah held her breath each time she felt the vehicle shift slightly toward the precipice. Emma had closed her eyes and buried her face in Tommy's shoulder, while the little boy watched the proceedings with the fascination that only children can maintain in the face of mortal danger. "Almost through the worst of it," Jake called back encouragingly. But as they rounded the final part of the curve, disaster struck. The mare, already nervous and exhausted, suddenly spooked at the sound of a rock slide higher up the mountain. The animal reared and twisted sideways, causing the wagon to lurch violently toward the edge of the trail. Jake threw his full weight against the horse's neck, trying to force her back toward the center of the path. But the wagon's momentum was carrying it inexorably toward the drop. The left rear wheel slipped over the edge, and Sarah felt the entire vehicle begin to tip. "Save my child before it falls!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. Time seemed to slow as the wagon tilted at an impossible angle. Sarah could see her children sliding toward the open side of the wagon bed, their faces frozen in terror. Baby Lucy's cradle was sliding across the wooden planks, and Tommy was grasping desperately for something to hold on to. Jake's years of mountain experience took over. Without hesitation, he released the horse's bridle and lunged toward the tilting wagon. His powerful hands caught Tommy just as the boy was about to tumble over the edge, lifting him clear of the wagon in one smooth motion. But Emma and the baby were still in mortal danger as the wagon continued its deadly tilt. The mare, freed from Jake's restraining grip, bolted forward and to the right, her survival instincts finally overcoming her panic. The sudden forward momentum created a brief moment where the wagon's weight shifted, giving Jake the split second he needed. He threw Tommy toward his mother, then dove into the wagon bed just as it reached the tipping point. His strong arms swept baby Lucy from her sliding cradle while simultaneously grabbing Emma around the waist. The wagon was now at such an angle that he was essentially standing on the side wall, holding both children against his chest. For a moment that lasted forever, the wagon balanced on the very edge of disaster. Jake could feel the vehicle swaying, could hear the groan of wood and metal as the wagon fought against gravity. One more inch, one more degree of tilt, and they would all plummet into the abyss. Sarah, still in the driver's seat but now hanging at an acute angle, reached desperately toward her children. "Jump!" she yelled to Jake. "Save them!" Jake calculated the distance to solid ground. It was perhaps 8 feet to where Tommy sat crying but safe beside the path. He would have to throw both children and hope they landed clear of the wagon's inevitable fall. "Emma, you're going to fly like a bird," he said with forced calm. "Tommy's going to catch you." Without waiting for a response, he hurled the 8-year-old through the air toward her brother. Emma landed hard but safely beside the trail, rolling clear just as Jake had hoped. But baby Lucy was too small to throw safely, too young to understand what was happening. The wagon gave another ominous creak and tilted further. Jake knew he had only seconds before the entire vehicle went over the edge, taking him and the baby with it. Jake clutched baby Lucy against his chest as the wagon reached its final moment of balance. The vehicle groaned like a dying animal, wood splintering under impossible stress. He could feel the exact instant when gravity won its battle, when physics took control and the wagon began its inevitable plunge into the ravine. In that split second, Jake made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of trying to jump clear and save himself, he used every ounce of his strength to launch the baby towards Sarah, who was still strapped to the driver's seat but now hanging almost upside down. "Catch her!" he shouted, putting everything he had into the throw. Baby Lucy sailed through the snowy air, her tiny blanket trailing behind her like wings. Sarah, operating on pure maternal instinct, twisted her body in ways that should have been impossible and caught her youngest daughter just as the wagon began its final tilt over the edge. Jake felt the wooden bed disappear from beneath his feet as the wagon started its tumbling descent into the canyon. But in that last moment, he saw something that gave him hope. The mare, still attached to the wagon by her harness, had found solid footing on a narrow ledge about 15 feet down the slope. The traces were stretched tight, and the wagon's forward progress had stopped, leaving it suspended at a steep angle against the canyon wall. He rode the tilting vehicle down until it crashed against the ledge, the impact throwing him clear onto a rocky outcrop. Pain shot through his left shoulder as he hit the stone, but he was alive and relatively uninjured. The wagon hung precariously above him, held only by the leather harness and the mare's desperate grip on the narrow shelf of rock. Above him, he could hear Sarah calling his name and the children crying. "Jake, are you alive? Can you climb back up?" Jake assessed his situation quickly. The ledge was solid enough to support his weight, but climbing back to the trail would be nearly impossible, especially with his injured shoulder. However, he noticed something that might save them all. The old logging road continued around the mountain. and he could see where it descended to meet this same ledge about a quarter-mile ahead. "I'm alive," he called back. "The road comes down to this level further on. Can you get the children and meet me there?" "The baby's hurt." Sarah's voice was thick with tears. "I think her arm is broken." Jake's heart sank. A broken arm in these conditions, with a blizzard approaching and no medical help for days, could be a death sentence for an infant. They needed to find shelter immediately and get that arm properly set. "Listen to me carefully," he shouted through the increasing wind. "Follow the trail around the mountain. It drops down to this level in about half a mile. There's an old mining cabin down here that might still have a roof. We can take shelter there and tend to the baby's arm." While Sarah gathered her children and what supplies they could salvage from their scattered belongings, Jake began exploring the ledge. The mare was exhausted but still alive, though he didn't know how long she could maintain her footing on the narrow shelf. He managed to unhitch her from the wagon's wreckage and found that she could walk carefully along the ledge toward the mining cabin he'd mentioned. The cabin, when he reached it, was in better condition than he'd dared hope. Built into the mountainside by miners decades earlier, it had stone walls and a partially intact roof that would provide crucial shelter from the storm. There was even a small cache of firewood left by previous travelers. It took Sarah nearly an hour to make her way down the treacherous path with 3 frightened children. Emma and Tommy walked while Sarah carried baby Lucy, whose left arm hung at an unnatural angle. The infant's cries had subsided to weak whimpers that worried Jake more than her earlier screaming. "Thank God you're safe," Sarah gasped as she stumbled into the cabin. "I thought we'd lost you for sure." Jake had already started a small fire in the stone fireplace, and the cabin was beginning to warm. He examined baby Lucy's arm with gentle fingers, his experience tracking lost persons having taught him basic field medicine. "It's broken, but it's a clean break," he announced. "I can set it, but we need to immobilize it properly. Do you have any cloth we can use for bandages?" Sarah tore strips from one of her petticoats, while Jake carefully straightened the tiny arm. Baby Lucy cried during the procedure, but weakly, and Jake was encouraged when she seemed to calm down once the arm was properly splinted and bound. The storm raged outside for 2 days, but the cabin provided adequate shelter. Jake managed to salvage some supplies from the wagon, including enough food to last them until the weather cleared. During the long hours of waiting, he and Sarah talked about their lives, their losses, and their hopes for the future. Jake learned that Sarah was not just running from poverty, but from her late husband's gambling debts. Men had come to their farm demanding payment, and she'd fled in the night with whatever she could carry. She was traveling under an assumed name, hoping to disappear into the anonymity of the frontier. On the 3rd morning, the snow stopped falling and pale sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window. Baby Lucy's fever had broken during the night, and though her arm would take weeks to heal properly, she was clearly going to survive. "The pass should be clear enough to travel now," Jake said, studying the sky. "But that wagon's finished, and the old mare's too exhausted for a long journey." He made a decision that surprised even himself. "I'm going to ride to the nearest settlement and bring back help. There's a doctor in Cedar Creek who can look at the baby's arm properly, and I know some folks there who might be willing to give a family a fresh start, no questions asked." Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Why are you doing this for us? You don't even know us." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying fire. "Let's just say that sometimes a man gets a second chance to do the right thing." 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell and her children were settled in a small house in Cedar Creek. Jake had arranged for Sarah to work as a seamstress for the local general store, and baby Lucy's arm had healed perfectly under the doctor's care. Jake visited regularly, officially, to check on their welfare, but increasingly because he'd found something in this makeshift family that he'd thought was lost forever. The mountain had tried to claim them all, but sometimes, in the most desperate moments, ordinary people find the strength to perform extraordinary acts of courage. Jake Thompson had earned his reputation as a tracker by finding lost souls in the wilderness, but on that snowy October day, he'd found something even more valuable. He'd found his way back to being the man he'd always wanted to be.